Ending our political conversation this week to a bit of a national scale, right? After getting our first real introduction to the GOP candidates looking to challenge President Joe Biden in next year's presidential election. The first Republican presidential debate coming a day before former President Donald Trump surrendered to authorities in Georgia, where he faces charges in relation to attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Joining me now to weigh in on these recent developments, political analyst Basil Smikle. Good to have you here.
Good to be here.
So let's begin with the GOP debate, right? Got fiery and feisty, and obviously the front runner here, Mr. Trump himself, not present. What did these contenders need to do to stand out?
So it's interesting. Without Donald Trump there, they had to find a way to differentiate themselves from him, from each other, but also be likable to the Republican primary voters. And depending on your sort of political leanings, some of them, and at certain points in time, try to look a bit ahead to the general election. But of course, getting out of the primary is the first goal for them.
Right, because it's a runaway train when you look at the poll numbers for Donald Trump,
right.
So were the folks on that stage really looking to say, well, who can he potentially pick to be a vice president?
Well, I do think someone like Ramaswamy, for example, who was, by all accounts, his chief supporter on the debate stage, he may not have come across as presidential, but he certainly came across as vice presidential. So maybe among the candidates that were there, Donald Trump probably finds him the least unattractive.
This is a guy who's 38 years old,
Right.
a billionaire, right? And a political outsider.
Right.
Sounds like Mr. Trump.
In many ways, yes. And if you're a primary voter, why vote for Trump light when you can have the original?
Right.
And so for these candidates, it was a very tricky road for them to walk because, again, they had to differentiate themselves from him, but they don't want to also alienate a lot of his supporters that might be looking for somebody else.
Okay, so when you look at it in the totality, right, you have the anti-Trump, which was Chris Christie, and then there's everybody else. So who really made a difference when it came to policy and substance?
I got to tell you, Nikki Haley sounded really strong. You know, she, based on the positions that she's had, and of course being a governor is very important because you have executive authority. So she came across really strong. I think she helped her case the most of the candidates that were there.
This is all depending on what the poll numbers look like after this debate, right? What is the former president's strategy moving into the next debate? Does he take the stage if somebody like a Ramaswamy or DeSantis comes up closer to him?
Well, part of his strategy was surrendering the day after the debate so we could stop talking about them and start talking about him again. So I think that's number one. And number two, I imagine at some point he's going to have to engage. If his numbers start coming down and somebody else starts to rise, if the big money donors that he probably doesn't have a lot of them right now, but if they start saying, you know, we're going to keep our powder dry and see who else is out there, he's going to have to start to engage. They will force him to do that at some point.
Those numbers haven't come down in terms of the indictments, right? So here we are now. Let's move on to the next topic, which is the former president indicted a fourth time. We thought it was historic the first time. Now we're at 4 in Georgia, right? The day after the debate. And his numbers have not moved. They've actually gotten higher.
He loves that. He loves this. He actually, in some ways, wants the indictment. You know, if you listen to Donald Trump's language, he talks about reclamation. He talks about retribution. In some ways, he also comes across as a bit of a martyr. So if he's not the aggrieved here, it kind of doesn't work with his narrative. And if you hear him talk, he loves to go back to his supporters and say, "Look at what they're doing to me. Look at what they're doing to us." That's very compelling for a supporter. And so it actually fits into the larger narrative.
But is there a bit of a fear here for him when it comes to Georgia? Georgia's different, right? We're going to possibly see a mugshot that's released, just like we saw with Rudy Giuliani and so forth. Is there a fear that this is actually a different kind of case with the RICO charges, and he can't pardon himself if he becomes president?
That's exactly right, and it's probably the most dangerous thing for him. If he ever became president of the United States again, this is something that he cannot run away from because he can't pardon himself here. And it's also, I would imagine, given the other charges, the scope of it is so startling. The number of people that are involved, and that's the RICO issue, that you can have all of these co-conspirators, even if they all weren't talking to each other, they were acting in concert. And so that's what's so dangerous for him because it touches so many people, and you have to think, some of those folks are not going to go down with the ship.
Right, well, that's what they're hoping for, right?
That's
With
exactly
that many people. Well, maybe somebody will turn. Briefly, because we're almost out of time, I want to talk about the migrant crisis, because that seems like it's going to be the talking point for Republicans trying to win back the House and the Senate, right? Saying, we want border policies in place and the Democrats don't. So how do they finagle the situation and work with it going into this election season?
Well, this is a very tough position for the mayor, for the governor, for Democrats broadly. Because remember, this is something that the Republicans initiated by sending migrants north, right? Because they wanted to prove that it wasn't just them, that these Northeast liberals couldn't deal with it. And guess what? The Northeast governors and mayors are having a difficult time. If New York City can't deal with it, how do you expect some of the smaller communities in upstate? So to avoid that, the governor and the mayor and the president, all of the same party, really need to get their act together. There's certainly some conversation, there's certainly coordination, and we are seeing some movement. But this is a humanitarian crisis that will boil over to the political landscape very, very soon.
Yeah, I mean, Jamal Bowman said we need to do this now and fix it. Basil, great to have you here as always. All right, thanks for being here.